Ross Harding is a 26-year-old young man, and he posted a question which was,
if all fossil fuels are going to run out in the next 130 years' time, and the Australian government invests 32 times more money in fossil fuels than they do in renewable energy and energy efficiency combined, why does the Australian government invest in the past when they could invest in the future? And what's the most effective use of young Australians' time and efforts to help transition Australia to 100% renewable energy?
Now, to represent Ross, we have a special guest who's a friend of Ross. This friend is a psychologist by trade. He's done his master's in psychology, and when he's not practicing psychology, he plays for the Australian Football League for the Carlton Blues. His name is Nick Duigan, and I want to invite him up to represent Ross on this question. Thanks for coming, Nick.
Thanks for having me. I've been following Ross on his journey for a few years now, and I think it's really important because young people around Australia and all around the world are really passionate about a sustainable energy future. And at the moment, those passions aren't being translated into real government action. And young people, and I think people everywhere really, of every age, want to know how best to utilise their time in order to have action and to see real action.
Well, Malcolm, it's a question very much about the future. What's your response?
The government and I think the opposition are both, if you like, playing to the past because they're playing to fears, they're playing to concerns. They're not really concerned about the truth of the matter, or I don't think they are. And they want votes. I think Ross Garner has done a very good job. But very often governments won't look far enough ahead. They look to focus groups and what will get them votes this week, next week, and for the next election. And they don't look much beyond that. I think they totally underwrite Australians because when Australians have been asked, or when people or governments have appealed to Australians, support this because it's important for a long-term future, Australians will step forward and support it. But neither the government nor the opposition are really giving Australians that choice at the moment.
But is it really possible for a government, particularly one like we've got at the moment, which is hanging on by a thread, to take unpopular decisions, any decisions that are brave?
Well, if they did take unpopular decisions that were brave and argued the points through, if their arguments are well marshalled, you've got to believe you can persuade the Australian people that was unpopular 6 months ago, they can make popular today because Australians have come to believe that it's right. And if governments just say, all right, focus groups, opinion polls, that's all it's about, then when people mark a poll or whatever, there hasn't generally been a public debate about it, an issue, there's been not much knowledge spread around about it, so you get an emotional, immediate reaction. And that's not the way you're meant to make policy. And the government is there, or meant to be there, to exercise its judgment. And if its judgment's any good, they ought to be able to persuade Australians that what they believe is best for long-term Australia is right. And if you have faith in Australian people, I would have thought that's a reasonable belief.
What do you think about that, Nick?
I think, yeah, as you're saying, politics seems to be driven by public opinion, but I suppose what Ross is wondering is how do we make a noise loud enough for the politicians to listen and to make real change?
Well, support OurSay have a whole lot of people in every marginal electorate saying that they want to question politicians on the issues and they want guarantees that the politician or the candidate will answer the questions. Don't let the politicians run away from the issue. Don't let them avoid them. Vote against any politician that says, oh, I'll have to refer this to head office to get the answer. You don't want that sort of person. The main reason we don't have longer-term policies put in front of us is because Australian politicians, and I think more so now than I believe since Australia was founded, are showing that they don't think much of Australians. Now, they'll all get up and deny that, but if they did think much of Australians, they'd say, look, you know, I can persuade this guy that, so he'll support the policy that's right for Australia, not just 5 years out, 10 years out, but 100 years out or 200 years out. And you don't see that sort of attitude in any politician today.
Is that politicians' fault, do you think, or media's fault, or the public's fault?
Oh, I think it's partly the media's fault, but I think it's much more politicians' fault because politicians feed the media. There were days when, you know, in a different world, in the last World War, which was certainly well before a lot of you were born or even twinkles in somebody's eye, people believed that the world had nearly destroyed itself, 2 world wars within 20 years, and everyone, victors and vanquished, knew that they had to do better. We've got to create something better. We've got to look to the longer term. And the United Nations was established, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, conventions negotiated under it, the World Bank, the Monetary Fund to try and prevent depressions of the kind that occurred in the 30s. And it was an optimistic time in spite of the Cold War. And there was a lot of progress in those years. But where do you find you know, political leaders of the substance of the political leaders that we had in the late 40s, 50s, 60s? I just don't think they're around.
Nick, what do you think about that? What do you think of the political leaders?
Well, at the moment, I think they're really not. There are many examples around the world of political leaders not following what they've been voted in for and what the public are asking for, and I think this is one example of that. And so I think there's enough evidence to support, you know, a transition into renewable energies, and I think there's enough public support for it. But at this stage, all the facts and all the support isn't transitioning into change, and that's what I suppose is frustrating the public a lot, and why questions like that get posed onto OurSay, and why we keep on going through these type of avenues to get change, because at the moment we're probably not seeing the change that everyone's asking for.
And if you want more action, put heat on politicians and put heat on candidates.
Yeah.
and put more and more.
Josh's question is, are transfer payments and other middle-class welfare, particularly those able to be received by the upper income brackets, driving a sense of welfare entitlement in Australia? Are they simply unsustainable masks over the inherent inequalities in our economic system?
That's a complex question. I'm not sure what high income is today. I know a lot of people. I know people with families who think $100,000, $150,000 is not a high income. Welfare payments going to the wealthy. I'm really not sure what you mean, but I don't think it's a particularly fair world. The fact that governments allow wealthy individuals to construct tax arrangements so that they might pay 4 or 5% income tax while ordinary people pay whatever the full rate is grossly unfair. And why are tax havens in the Cook Islands, the Caribbean, why are these allowed? Why doesn't every country come up and say, we're going to abolish that? I had somebody who was getting a job in New York with one of the financial firms. You know, he was an Australian and said, everyone seemed to get most of the salary put into a Caribbean account. Wasn't that a bit shonky? I said, no, it's not a bit shonky, it's just shonky.
I mean, a large part of your political career was motivated by anti-communism. You're in favour of free enterprise. Mm. Yeah. So where's the balance here between government giving any kind of welfare and a free enterprise system where people reap the reward of their enterprise?
People should be encouraged to reap the reward of their enterprise, but that doesn't mean evading normal rules, doesn't mean establishing special circumstances so that you don't pay the tax that you should pay. And there are a lot of people, I think, that do it. And in my time, I know the government was bedeviled by people trying to avoid paying tax. Some of the things we did to overcome that were pretty unpopular because suddenly people had to pay tax.
You're talking about bottom of the harbour tax schemes and so on that were in your time.
That was one of the worst of them,
And
but it wasn't the only one.
many members of the Liberal Party involved in that too.
Oh, not only the Liberal Party. Many people from all parties would have been involved in that, because there are many millionaires in the Labour Party also. It's not a... Millionaire or not, it's not a party political divide anymore. It really isn't. Or billionaire, I suppose you've got to start saying today. But a government has an obligation to look after disadvantaged people in the community, to try and, I believe, keep welfare as low as possible, but at the same time to try and create the circumstance where everyone has an opportunity to get as far ahead as they want to get and as their abilities will allow them to get. And that has implications for education, it has implications for all sorts of things in life, and implications for what governments ought to do. Everyone pays their taxes. I can't see why child allowances shouldn't go to everyone. I don't really... It was brought in without a means test.
And why was that? Because it was Malcolm's government, I have to say, which brought in child endowment, for those of you who don't know, and you decided it went to everyone, and it went to the woman in the family specifically. Why?
Well, it went to the woman in the family because in those days not too many women worked, not enough work now, although a lot more. Still some that don't. And in some families, the bloke was a bit mean, I suppose. And it was probably thought that the woman would make a... I don't agree with income management as it's been brought in more recent times, but it was a mild form of income management. But the mother was going to do the income managing. And I think that worked well. It went to everyone because the previous system was a tax-based system which benefited most the wealthy. And the wealthier you were, the more benefit you get because the higher your marginal tax rate. And that was inherently unfair. But I had a bit of a battle to get that measure through the cabinet. And if I had tried to put a means test on it and say that wealthy people aren't going to get anything when they've had everything, it wouldn't have gone through. But in any case, I thought it just that it should be paid to all mothers.
So how much of a safety net is an Australian citizen entitled to expect effectively from their fellow citizens, from the government, from the state?
In money terms, I can't put a money value on it. But I think we should expect people to be able to live in a reasonable degree of comfort. And we do a lot better than many countries, infinitely better than the United States, in looking after people with inadequate resources of their own. Our health system for low-income people is so much better than America's, although Obama's changes are trying to catch up a bit, but we'll still be way, way ahead. And a number of provisions for the elderly, I think, are reasonable, but some aspects of healthcare have been neglected. There'll always be something that's falling behind. And then when the community gets to know about it, hopefully there'll be enough pressure on governments to try and do something about it. But, you know, many, many long years ago, somebody called Henderson established a sort of poverty line, and then there were efforts to keep a relationship between pensions and the poverty line. Well, all of that would be so out of date in today's world, and the country is wealthier. And if the country is wealthier, it should try and establish the circumstance where people who are less well off or dependent upon welfare can be better off than they would otherwise be. But putting a specific, you know, that's why I find it difficult with this question. You know, putting a dollar figure on it is very difficult.
How rich is rich, how poor is poor.
Yes.
If we know carbon dioxide emissions are warming the planet, if that warming could have catastrophic impacts on our planet, if we don't act quickly enough to stop these impacts, whose fault is that? Charlie and Holly, do you want to come up?
So tell me, why is this important to you? How did you first find out that this was happening?
Well, for a very long time, my dad's been doing energy efficiency stuff, and he's had 2 big companies and been trying to help with lots of different things. So I've just kind of grown up with like realizing and seeing what this problem is, and as you go through it, you slowly realize it's like we're really getting ourselves in trouble. And as I was a little kid, we used to, like, we had a trolley at one point, and we were friends with lots of people in the street. We used to get tons of light bulbs, energy efficient, and we just go down the street. And I think it's such an important issue, because if we keep doing this, it's going to be a horrible place. It's just going to go haywire, and it's.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone here would hope that that horrible place isn't the one that you have to finish growing up in. But Malcolm, would you respond to the question, please?
Well, I'd blame politicians first for failing to listen to the facts and for failing to act, for playing politics with too many issues, including this issue, which has a fundamental influence on our long-term future. But I wouldn't only blame politicians. We've all got to share some of the blame for not paying enough attention to the people we elect as politicians and how they're elected. And so that means much more involvement. That can be awkward, it can be difficult, it can be unpleasant. But at the end of the day, we can't just go on assuming Australia will be well governed and leave it to the traditional political parties to produce good candidates, because I think they've demonstrated very clearly over the last 25 years that the quality of candidates is depreciating.
What do you think of the Greens these days, Malcolm?
Well, on some things they're standing out, but I'm not sure how much they're influencing the government. The press and when I say the press, News Limited and the opposition try and say that the government has been captured by the Greens. I don't think that's true. I think on some things I'd like to see the Greens taking a tougher stance than they have. Not all their policies are good, but on some things, you know, in today's world, it would be much better that the Greens have the balance of power in the Senate, as they will do in a few days, than the Liberal Party have control of the Senate. Because it has gone so conservative, so reactionary, so negative, and they've demonstrated they'll play politics with anything.
Charlie and Holly, do you blame somebody? Do you have hope for politicians, or?
I was just wondering before about when you said how it wasn't just the politician's fault. You also need to. It's also the individual. They need to choose who's gonna go forward and make the decisions for us better. What's one of the ways? Because there's quite a few politicians that say they're gonna do stuff that they don't. How's a really good way to get them to commit to what they say, or get them to follow through with it?
Well,
Very good question.
I think you try and create mechanisms that will hold them accountable. The pre-selection process is very important, and I know some people have been talking about making a primary system accountable, so that if you've got what seat are we in? Doesn't matter. We're in a seat. And if people within that seat register and say they're Labour or Liberal, then the candidates, yep, this is before the real election, it's just to decide who's going to be the Labour candidate or who's going to be the Liberal candidate. You register as a Labour voter, and then you can help vote for that candidate. And if you said that nobody can be made candidate unless at least there are 2,000 people registered on the roll as a Labour candidate, and 2,000 on the roll for the Liberal candidate, have the Commonwealth Electoral Office conducting the primaries. Now, they have a primary system in the United States, different in different states, but in some I think it works quite well, and others probably it's too controllable. But if you did it well, you could break the power of the party factions. They might be able to control a couple of hundred pre-selectors. They're not going to be able to control 2,000, 3,000, or if you think they might, make the number 5,000. And then that's giving people at an earlier stage in the democratic process a much bigger say is who's going to stand, and then the person chosen by that, right, he's the person who stands at or she at the election. That's one thing that could be done to help change the present power structures. It would certainly break the faction system as it exists in the Liberal Party and in the Labour Party, I think in pretty well every state of the Commonwealth.
Charlie, it'll be 3 years until you cast your first vote,
Yeah.
I guess. Do you have any idea as to how you might be able to use that vote? And Holly, feel free to chime in here. 8 years for you until you cast your first vote. Do you have any feeling as to how you might use that vote to help the issue that you're concerned about?
I don't know at the moment. I guess you just got to find the thing that seems right so you just got to think of what all the things that you want to have, and then see whichever politician or group brings you closest to those things. Whether it be like climate change, or if you're worried about peace, or taking soldiers out of different. It's just depending on what you want to see in a politician, then you choose different people. So I'm not sure at the moment, but
No. Holly, what would you like to see in a politician that you might vote for?
Well, I'm not sure.
That's okay. Charlie, do you have any answer to that? What you'd like to see? What makes a good politician from your point of view?
the thing about not being the whole thing about pulling out of things because the opposition leader is telling you that it's a bad idea and things. I think you need to I think someone needs to say that it's a really big issue and we need to take control of it, and just following through with things, and it's just really important to just get rid of the issues that we're faced with. And I think the closer we can get to that, it's just I don't know, it'd be really good if there was somebody who could help out with all different issues.
Well, Malcolm, how hard is that for a politician, for a Prime Minister, to actually have the courage of their convictions and stick to them?
Well, it can be difficult, but it's not impossible, and it's been done in the past. It really has. But it was bipartisan. For many years, Australia had a bipartisan policy in relation to immigration and refugees. And the immigration and the humanitarian migration out of Indochina in the late 70s and the 80s was made much easier because it was a bipartisan policy, and the Labour Party in Parliament didn't play politics with the issue. If they'd tried to, it would have been very much more difficult. And maybe, I'm not sure where it would have ended up. I know my view wouldn't have changed. But in some things which are important to us as a nation, you've got to have a bipartisan policy. But another example, exporting uranium out of a national park, an Aboriginal national park, on Aboriginal land, was obviously going to be very difficult. But in the end, we had took about 18 months, but in the end, the Aboriginals supported us, the environmentalists accepted it, but there'd been expert inquiries and a lot of discussion, and we really believed that we could make the world safer by being out there in the trade. We'll only sell to countries who've signed the non-proliferation treaty, and we will always exact the most stringent safeguards. But in today's world, both the Liberal Party and I'm not sure what the position of the Labour Party is, they were fiddling with it for a while, but the Liberal Party certainly have said they'll sell uranium to India, which is not a signatory to the non-proliferation treaty. And so that, at the very least, enables them to divert more of their own uranium to weapons purposes, if they want to. I think if you go back, you know, establishing the migration program, which Arthur Calwell did, but with the support of the then opposition, was an act of statesmanship, because people were coming from all sorts of different places. At the time, Australia supported, or the politicians all supported, and on record, the White Australia policy. But they soon set about trying to break that down. But it gets back to people having some idea of a longer-term future, and you've got to have that conviction. If a leader's got that conviction, you can persuade other people to follow you. And if there were leaders in the parties now prepared to look further ahead and back the policies they believe to be right instead of policies that they think are expedient, then I think there are a lot of people in both parties who would take the principal point of view. But when the leadership doesn't come from people at the top, and especially when the political parties have got become so controlled by the factions and pre-selections are controlled, and if somebody steps out of line, they'll lose pre-selection. You know, it gets very difficult for the individual politician.
Well, I suspect that some of the long-term future is sitting on my right. Thank you very much to you two for your questions.